last couple of weeks. And we've been having a look very closely at how we can improve the language, I guess, around the definitions of must support due to some of the difficulties that we've been having in the TDG in understanding what this actually means for implementers and downstream IG developers, etc. So I'm just going to basically run through a few slides just to, again, I guess, reiterate, making sure that we're fully understanding what is the must support, the meaning of must support as it currently stands, and then start looking at the definitions of the obligations that Danielle has started to introduce the concept of, and how we might be able to use those obligations in our IG, and in particular, how we may be able to use that same language that the obligations define as part of defining our more general must support. So just start off with stating some I guess, facts from the current FHIR standard, not AU core, but the FHIR standard. So basically labeling an element as must support means that implementations that produce or consume resources shall provide support for the element in some meaningful way. The must support flag does not define exactly what support for an element means. And when a profile contains an element labeled as must support, it shall also make clear exactly what kind of support is required. And we do that in a couple of ways, by providing a narrative description of the obligations, as we actually have done in AU core. Alternatively, we can also provide a narrative description within the element itself. So I don't believe that we've got any examples of that in AU core at the moment, where on a particular element that we've actually stated the must support obligations. We are always referring back to the general description of must support within the guidance conformance page. And now with these new obligations extensions, we can actually be explicit on a per element basis. What are the detailed expectations for a must support? So the next item here is, and there seems to be, based on some of the feedback we're getting from the ballot, a little bit of confusion around when do we use obligations and when do we use must support. The actual FHIR specification says that we first label something with must support and then add obligations to it. So it's not an either or. Obligations are in addition to a must support. Is there any comments or questions to this point on these few slides? Okay. So the obligation extension has a value set, and it is composed of a couple of codes. There is an initial one, a qualifier, shall, should, or may, and then there's some functional codes, things like populate, no error, handle, display, persist, etc. And I've got some references down the bottom here on what that value set is, and there's a couple of versions of this value set. So do not go to the actual base FHIR extension, because that's currently obsolete and being reworked. So the terms that I'm presenting today is based on that first reference, which is in the current build continuous integration branch of the FHIR extensions value set. So in AU core, as I said, we actually have a narrative description of what is the must support obligations. And what we've got for the responder is a couple of shalls, and the second dot point is the most important, which is basically saying that we shall populate the element unless it is not available for that patient, or the requester does not have access to the element, in which case we need to actually apply the suppressed data requirements, which is stated elsewhere. And if there is missing data for a patient, if it's not mandatory, then we just don't populate it. If it is mandatory, then we must abide by the missing data rule, which is effectively adding some extensions or using a code that basically says it's unknown, etc. So again, that's defined elsewhere in the missing data section, which we won't go into today. On the a requester side of things, we get a little bit more vague, in my opinion. So we are capable of meaningfully processing resources with must support elements, be able to process resource instances containing elements with missing or suppressed data. So those extensions, for example, or unknown codes. We may choose to reject non-conformant resources, and we shall interpret missing data elements within resource data. So I think this is potentially where we're starting to get a little bit more trouble in our understanding, is around the requester, not so much on the producer or the responder. Richard. Richard? No?
Oh, is that working?
Yes.
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 Problems with my microphone, sorry. That first one says that you're not allowed to request data that you can't process. Is that intended?
Shall be capable of meaningfully process resources with.
This is a requester. So this says a requester.
Mm-hmm.
As I read it, this says a requester is not allowed to request information that it can't process.
No, it's actually talking about the response, on how it processes the response to the request. So yes, it's the requester role, but it's how they process the response to their request.
Right. Yep. Okay. So a requester is, yep. Okay. Okay. So it's the requester saying, I'm making a request and this is what I can accept.
Well, no, we're actually not saying, okay, well, that's a different opinion, perspective, but basically what AU Core is saying is, as a requester, you must be able to, or shall be able to, meaningfully process the resource.
Process a resource that you've requested if it has this information.
Yeah. So if we have a must support elements, and let's say it is the status of a procedure, you shall meaningfully process that status.
Well, that resource.
With must support elements, yes, that's right. That resource.
Yes, that might, for some systems, mean they have to process the element, but for others, it might not.
But let's not try and interpret this, because this is exactly what this whole session is about, is trying to improve this language. I think we've just highlighted exactly what I think is a bit of a problem with how do we actually interpret these statements.
Okay, so on this one, if I request a resource and it's got must support on 5 elements, I must be able to meaningfully process those 5 elements.
No.
Let's move on. And
yes.
I think we'll address your questions going forward. But it's this kind of ambiguity in this section in particular. There's probably some ambiguity in the responder as well, but in this section, I think it's very loose. And that's what we're trying to tighten up. Because it's really that capable of meaningfully processing is the problem. So what does that actually mean? There's a little bit of
So
post
before you move on though, we do have Sanjeev with his hand up.
Okay.
Does point one also cover the scenario where the requesting system probably does not support an element, but the source system supports it, so it's part of the payload, but the requesting system is not aware on how to handle it because.
Let's perhaps just move on and again ask your question again if it doesn't get answered in the following slides. Hopefully it will get more clear going forward on what we think we really intend.
Okay.
And the goal of this session, not necessarily to make a decision here, is to be in a position to be able to make a decision going forward. Okay, where am I? I've gone backwards. All right, so if we continue, if we can continue with the requester. So on the left-hand side is what I've just basically displayed. As we're moving towards looking at using obligation codes, the obligation code that we think is the code that we actually really mean is something called shall no error. So shall no error means that conformant applications shall accept resources containing any valid value for the element without error. Does that help both you and Sanjit and Richard?
I find shall no error clear, but I see it as being different to meaningfully processing resources.
Great. Okay. That's good that it's clear. And then let's dive in a little bit deeper. So the notes associated with this says that applications still able to inform the user that a value cannot be processed and may ignore the data, but applications aren't able to reject an instance merely because the element is present. So for you, Sanjeev,
Yeah, that
what
point.
we're talking about is the must support elements only.
So we're not rejecting the entire resource. We are just saying we cannot process that specific element. Is that what the request and
So we're saying that you must be able to support, or you shall be able to support must support elements. You may not be able to without error. Okay. So if you get something else that's not marked as must support, there is no obligation on you not to error.
Okay, but if again, sorry, probably we can discuss it separately. I mean, I'm still a bit confused because if source system has an element which is in that system and it is must support and the requester does not have that element in the system, which means they're not obliged to support it, right? And how will this be handled?
I've got some examples later on. Hopefully we can dive into a little bit deeper into that. That might make it easier to deal with. Okay, a system may raise an error if the value provided is not valid.
And there are two hands up, Heath.
Okay.
Got Andy?
This is never going to be easy. In that first bullet point where it says applications are still able to inform the user, so that's not an obligation to inform the user. So you don't have to inform the user. So the only thing this is requiring you to do is not error out. Basically, that's the only thing.
Exactly. Or must support elements.
Got it.
So a system may raise an error in the second dot point if it is invalid, right? So if you've got a status that is not a valid value, you may error on that. But if it is a valid value, you may not. You shall not error.
This seems a very different foundation than meaningfully process.
And you're probably right. And I think I'm hearing Richard say the same thing. All right, Dylan.
The way I understand it is you must minimally process the resource and not the element. So, for instance, say a patient has must support and birth date. Your system cares nothing about birth date. I don't know which clinical system doesn't care, but your system cares nothing about birth date. So you should still be able to process the patient resource and not worry about the must support element on the birth date, even if it's missing data or not. You just interpret it correctly. That's how I'm understanding.
It's not whether it's missing data, if it actually exists. If the data exists because it's must support, so the obligation, the responder has provided to it because they're obligated to provide a value for must support.
Yes, but my system doesn't have to support the birth date just because it's a must support element on the.
But you have to accept the
You have to
resource.
accept the yes. I have to
Yeah,
accept
and
the
so I think that is actually helpful the way you've specified that. I have to accept the resource that contains a value that has must support without error.
Yes. Okay, that's kind of how I've understood it.
I think if we, to your point, Andy, if you go through some of the other dot points in the left-hand side as well, it starts to clarify that first dot point a little bit. So I'll see the hands up, but the first dot point is not sufficient, and then we try and elaborate further or clarify further in the subsequent 3 dot points. And really, this is coming to a point where do we think these actually correspond what we used to have? Because this is what we've been talking about around what it means. I just don't think that we've actually stated it very easily or very well in English language that everyone understands. Richard again.
Shall no error, as you've described it, sounds to me like the recommended behavior for all resources or all elements that aren't must support, because can ignore sorry. My understanding is that the recommended behavior in FHIR is if an element is not must support, then you are at liberty to ignore it. And it is unfriendly to reject something because it has stuff that you're not interested in. And so this shall no error seems to be very close to saying, well, that's the preferred FHIR behavior for everything that isn't must support. So that winds up being, as Andy said, this is a really low bar. And in fact, I go so far as to say it's so low that it winds up being noise. You're saying treat this as if it, like don't error it. You can ignore it. Seems to be what FHIR expects you to do for things that aren't must support.
I'll let Michael go next.
Yeah, I just wanted to confirm that we can have multiple obligations here assigned, right? So we can say shall, no error, should, some other option, may, something else, and combine them together.
Well, that's how obligations in general work. But what we're trying to do is find basically, in almost Richard's words, the baseline of what must support means before we start to layer on anything on top of that any further.
Is there anything else?
As Richard said, it is perhaps a low bar, but it is the default bar. And it's not to be honest, Richard, there is actually a lower bar, which is effectively
There is may ignore, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So there is a lower bar, and we are stating a default, which is a higher bar, but still pretty low. And then yes, there are many other layers on top of that if we look at the value set.
Yeah. So if we're looking here at this is the lowest bar, right, for AU core as a whole, then that's fair. But we can still add obligations in other parts to raise the bar where it's needed. Is that
Correct.
Yeah.
And so the point of this is to just to really kind of say, okay, what we really meant by the left-hand side, we've actually been talking about as no error. So the only obligation on the client is that they don't error on an element that is marked as must support. They still may error on an element that is not marked must support, but that's not what AU Core is obliging them to do.
It's a little tighter. You can't error unless it's invalid.
Correct. So if you've got a valid value, you can't error just because it's populated. And that's all we're trying to actually say right now with this obligation for a client.
But the suggestion is that you're allowed to do that for elements that aren't must support. So if I've got a patient and there isn't a must support on electronic communication, I'm allowed to error on that and say, you didn't advise me that you might send me an electronic communication, so I'm going to raise an error.
Right.
Yeah. I think, and part of this discussion will be we've got to realize that obligations on clients, you can't really assert what a client is going to use or needs to do its business, right? So by adding obligations about meaningful use of something, an element, implies that the client cares about that, right? And needs to care about it. So I think no error is kind of that very minimal bar that you'll accept valid instances. And that's not just must support elements, that's any valid, it's still valid if it's FHIR and it's an element we say nothing about. Okay, so as long as it's compliant, you shouldn't error, right? You won't error. So yeah, but I think we've got to be really careful about what we're saying needs to be actually used within AU Core specifications, because we don't know what the clients need, and we don't know what the clients are going to be processing. You may just want to know that the client might want to just know that the resource type exists and not care about any of the element content. So this is, that's the reality of putting obligations on elements, right? So we have to really be thinking very carefully about what we want to say. That's all I want to say. Yeah, cool.
Hence the low bar. Angus.
I was wondering if it's worth reiterating why we have must support in the first place, which is where you have optional, you want to define an optional element for a creator of a resource, but you don't want those individuals to just go, oh, it's optional, I just won't bother with it, right? Why would I ever populate it? It's optional, I just don't have to worry about it. And must support is trying to say it's optional, but if you have that content, you must provide it. Something like time of birth, right? We not everyone has time of birth, but if we made time of birth must support, we're saying you don't have to give it to us if you don't have it, but if you do have it, you must give it to us. And then the other side of the fence, which is the receivers of these resources, we're trying to say, if the clients are doing the right thing, you can't error. We don't care what you do with that data, but if the clients are doing the right thing, they're giving you time of birth where they have it, you can't then error because they're doing the right thing. What you do with time of birth is up to you. You can do nothing with it, but you can't error back to the guy doing the right thing on the other side of the fence.
Beautifully stated.
Yeah, Angus, I find your explanation a lot clearer than what's presented on the slides. But I do have a questions related to your response by saying that the receiving system may choose not to do anything about it. Isn't this kind of contrary to the must support that at least impose a responsibility or obligations on the receiving system that you must be able to process it, and not. I mean, I'm a bit concerned about the comment about they don't have to do anything about it.
But then we've got Brett's scenario. It's like, well, we can't state as AU core to say what is their business. All we're saying is that at least as a requester, you have to be able to accept it, because as Angus said, it is the obligation of the responder to give it to you if they have it.
But is support in that context means that you must accept it. I take it as more than you must accept it. They must support.
Yeah, but you can't assert use of the information because you do not know what the client's business is. There's no use case. Just
yeah, but the support to what I understand from interactions with others discussions kind of infers to me that must support is more than just accepting. Must support infer a responsibility of processing.
No, it
which
is
more than receiving.
No, in the same.
It implies the must support is highlighting elements that are relevant, and obligations are actually stating what you must do with them. So I think it's until you have a use case. So if I had a use case that required clinical use of that information, my obligations would be different. Whereas
again,
you can't say that in AU core that is true, right? Yeah.
And
there will always be some clinical use cases that require the data to be processed. We haven't
but AU core is not saying what those are. That is the responsibility for downstream IGs, including vendors, because AU core does not know enough about how it's going to be handled downstream or by vendors. All right, so that's Brett explained it very well. Again, all must support does is say you must support, but not how. And that's why we're starting to overlay the obligations as part of our must support and say within AU core, the base level obligation for any requester for a must support element is to not error. Because we are not going to say anything more than that, because we have no idea what a downstream system is going to do with it. And this is an integration specification. It is not a clinical implementation specification. Michael.
Yeah, I completely agree with Brett and Angus. The definitions helped a lot. I think there's actually a problem there with our original definition about that meaningful process, because without the meaningful process, the definitions are very similar and there's no real contention. I think what we're talking about here is that meaningful process, which is exactly all the things that we've just said, that we can't infer meaningful process because depending on the use case, meaningful process, maybe throw it away, right? I don't use it. So I think actually it helps by removing that meaningful process for the requester. I mean, the responder, a different story, but for the requester, that, yeah, exactly what was said, the use case, the specific usage of it, we can't infer from AU core. Downstream IG is good with specific use cases, but in AU core, we can't.
So let's just have a clarification on this slide. The left side, the narrative is the original. That's what's currently in AU core. And I guess what's on the right is what we're working towards around if we adopt obligations, what the replacement is, basically. It's not let's smack them both together. It's that the left is the original text and the right, as we move towards clarifying our language and using the FHIR standards codes and descriptions of the obligations that are possible, is to set a bar for the AU core content. And what's on this slide is, let's say that shall no error is that bar. for requesters.
And what we've been talking about, even though I think in meetings, we've been talking about this concept of just basically it means no error, but there is that ambiguous first dot point, as Michael said, that is around meaningful processing. And that's the arbitrary one. As you can see, there's the other dot points are quite well mapped, as Michael said. It's like about, may be rejected. We need to be able to support the missing data extensions, etc. So perhaps if Richard, and I see Neil as well. So Richard again, and then I would like to move on to the next one, which is talking about responder.
I guess my thought is that this makes what I think of as the recommended default behavior in FHIR of not erroring unwanted information look like special behavior that is called out. And I think it's very easy to then wind up having people think that, well, if I haven't got a must support on it, then it's straightforward me to error that and so raise the cost of integration by expecting people to send trimmed down resources in every interaction rather than simply having a thing of ignore what I don't want. So I like the definition. I'm concerned about its adoption as being the default meaning of must support.
I have a rebuttal to that, but I am cognizant of the fact that you wanted to cover more, Heath, and should this come up again, like maybe we should leave this to another Conformance Friday to continue that, I guess, the concern on being really clear that rather than it just being good behavior, it's required behavior.
Okay, yep, I'm happy to move on.
Yeah, Neil?
Hi, just quickly, I think one scenario I was thinking of with what Stephen said regarding birth date and birth time, if the receiver doesn't support birth time, say birth date is 20th of April, birth time 1300, on the receiver side, they only take the birth date, then they're making an assumption that it's the time is could be midnight or like the start of the day. And I guess that's the only caveat with this. I don't have any issue with it, but I'm just thinking that's probably one instance where the birth date being must support is a warning to the receiver to say, hey, you can ignore it, but it means something.
Yeah. And I guess there is some scenario. I think I understand also where, Richard, you're coming from, but I think there's nuances in between what I think you're saying, which is the default behavior of FHIR, which is to be able to process a resource, even with optional elements being populated and just being ignored silently, versus where someone is there's actually a valid value in a optional element and the downstream system not being able to process that value and decides that he wants to actually raise an error instead. And what this is saying is that you can't if it's getting a valid value. So flipping back to the responder, and I think again, hopefully this is a less contentious because I think Angus really described it very nicely, but we've got a couple of dot points on the left-hand side. The top one is our standard one, which is basically saying that a responder must populate an element unless with must support unless the element is not available or has been suppressed. So the right-hand side is basically saying, or the populate obligation is saying that it's defined as shall include the element if a value is known and allowed to be shared. So it's very much equivalent in meaning, in my opinion. We do go further on and define what we should do when values are mandatory and optional but missing. but that's just an elaboration more so than the obligation. Any comments on that, Marvin?
So do we, if something is available but should not be shared or cannot be shared, is there some way for someone to know that, or is that something that it's just not supplied? Should there be a can't be seen, or not available, or
so the suppressed data section talks about that. Suppressed data in particular, if it's a rights issue, there is a way to deal with it from that perspective, to tell downstream that it has been suppressed, if they're even allowed to do that. Otherwise, it basically gets treated like it was missing. But that's, the detail is in that, and that's not really the topic for today.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's too much contention around that one at the moment either. So, so just to elaborate, Andy, go on.
I'm glad it's talking about allowing to be shared, as in ensuring that consent is not breaking this. But I guess my other wariness about this is creating data sharing as a viral obligation. And it may be that a particular context of use has no need for certain information within its narrow context of use. And in that case, the requirement to share might not actually be appropriate, even though it's allowed.
Yeah, I can see your concern about the word shared, because it does potentially, but that's more, this is a definition from HL7, so we probably need to take that up with HL7 more so. But if we think about it, I guess in the context of access more so than share, yeah, I get that.
Are there weaker forms than shall populate that would cover situations where like is relevant to populate or something or other like that?
Well, there's there is another code that we have been discussing that we're waiting to get some clarity from HL7 on. So yes, there is a weaker version of it, and the set of people that were trying to prepare this the other day are going back to get further clarity. But at the moment, based on this definition, this is what we think is the meaning of our current intent of must support in AU core.
I see Andy's point about his concern on share, but the issue with FHIR is an exchange standard. So if it's not about sharing, then what is it about?
Yeah, and I think where Andy's going with shared is the further like sharing on further beyond this request. Whereas I think the intent of this in this definition of shared is in the context of this request and this request only.
My issue is more around the nature of AU core as being a very general foundation, and to require, in effect, a totality of data that is populated within a specific domain of use. It may be within that domain of use that the inclusion of some of these must support attributes is not actually relevant to the problem that this solution is solving, and to share for sharing's sake, kind of without taking into account its context of use, seems a very broad thing. It's much easier to do this in a narrow focus, in a IG that is focused on a particular, you know, a narrow outcome, whereas something that is very broad, like AU Core, an obligation of must populate if you hold this data, only really works in very generic, broad kind of server settings, which I don't think will always be the case.
And again, I think we need to be careful we don't overcomplicate this with the real world. That effectively this is a request between request between a requester and a responder. The responder doesn't know what the requester is going to do with that data, but there is a trust relationship between them, the fact that there is some level of access control, and the responder has done what it can to restrict access based on the rights that were actually allocated to the requester. And the sharing nature of that is in the context of those rights for this request. Angus.
So make 2 points. One is, and this is the point I was trying to make before, and this is probably the better slide for it, is the reason this is here is because in the past, we would make things optionals and lazy developers would go, forget about all the optionals. What are the mandatories I have to populate? And this is trying to say, you can't forget about this optional. You must try and populate this optional element, even if you can't. Like it's like, yeah, but I don't have that data. Well, then you don't have to give it to us, but you must try and give it to us if you have it. Is the reason we have must support. The second one is I'm not sure. I'm not sure why we call it, why your titles are requester and responder. It seems to be hard to contemplate. Why aren't we just calling it resource creator and resource consumer? Because the responder isn't necessarily the one who has control over how the resource was created. Like in some scenarios, I might be providing the resource to someone, but I didn't create the resource. I'm not.
Exactly. No, that's really important. It's not the rules on how it got created in the first place to a degree. It's an API. It's the RESTful API. It's not about the rules on how it gets created originally. It's not a producer.
But if I'm responding, and in responding I'm changing content, then I'm a creator, right? Like I'm trying to keep it. I just worry that requester and responder is hard to think about.
Did you respond to this in the ballot, Angus?
No. I didn't understand what responder
So these
meant.
are application roles. These are the application roles that are being defined by AU Core, and that's why we're using them. I understand where you're coming from, but that's
okay.
If we can keep on topic, because we're not getting very far.
If they're defined at that level, I'm not going to argue that.
And I'll just point out here, the reason we've got these is so we avoid having to say create and update is mandatory, right? Because it's not about the creation. It's about access. It's about how do I ask for data? What do I get back? And that's kind of why we've avoided the creator aspect, because that immediately brings in the fact that people say, you must implement the ability to create all of these.
And when e-requesting, for example, starts creating your application roles, such as filler and placer and whatever else you defined, these particular obligations do not apply to your application roles. These are the obligations of an AU Core responder role. And you get to basically go and redefine your obligations. So, but that's way beyond the scope of today's presentation.
Appreciate.
But I do like you reiterating again that point around cardinality is different, because that is the point that the specification, FHIR specification, makes in the definition of populate, that it is not the same as cardinality, and it is populating the element if you've got data, not your choice. You have to. And the other aspect that I just want to pull out here as well is that element around if the data exists. We've been talking about, well, if a system doesn't even have the concept, then that's equivalent to the data not existing. We haven't made it explicit. On the left-hand side, it's not explicit, but we've felt that it was sufficient just to say that the value is known. It means that for this patient or by this system, it's kind of inferred that if someone doesn't support a date of birth time, that's equivalent to value being unknown. Michael.
Yeah, the conversation's moved on a little bit, but just on Andy's point he was raising before, I was wondering if the concern is more about the use of must support in AU core versus the definition of must support, as in using it sparingly because we don't want to enforce obligations on a high level standard, not knowing where it's going to be used. But
Okay, so what does it actually look like? I've got 10 minutes to time, so I guess I just very quickly wanted to work through what does this actually mean if we started using obligations as extensions within a profile. So this is something that Danielle mocked up on what it would look like. And because obligations are stated at a element level, it will end up having the server client actors, and I'm not sure, will they actually be server and client, or will they be responder and requester? Danielle?
Sorry, I had to find my mute. I think they would end up being requester and responder.
Okay. Yeah.
We'll use the actor definition resource in FHIR to define the system actors.
Yep. Okay, so on the screen would actually be AU responder, AU requester, not server and client. As Andy said, server is responder or equivalent to. Because we are talking about actor roles, not actual implementations. So we're talking about going from narrative to obligations. Now I'm looking at, okay, now that we've got this terminology that we perhaps have better defined, as in shall no error, shall populate, can we use that to better define our narrative for our default meaning of must support in AU core? So we're looking at perhaps reusing or redefining must support for an AU core requester as such. So shall not error when processing resources with must support elements, shall not error when processing resources containing elements with missing data or suppressed data, and may reject invalid resources. And then just go a little bit further and say when a profile requires a more tightly stated obligation of a must support element, the obligation extension is specified on that element. So as I was showing here, this starts getting quite verbose if we start defining obligations on every element. Now, we may end up doing that anyway, and maybe it's just a rendering of the publisher. But what I'm proposing is that we better define our must support definitions as a default and then use the obligations to override those defaults as stated in this point here. And then a little bit of an elaboration here to say that how the requester processes the resource depends on local requirements. And this goes to, I think, Richard's and Stevens, which is that they may include display, persist, print, and ignore. We're not going to say those in AU core, but the requester may interpret them as any of those. And they're in blue here because They are actually defined obligations in FHIR. Display, persist, print, and ignore are some examples of the consumer obligation codes. Any comments? So basically what I'm proposing, this is a redefinition of must support for requester. Do people think that this is a better way of defining that compared to previous? Andy?
I find it a little weird when you refer to shall not error when processing resources with must support elements. The word with is kind of strange. If a resource has a must support element, is the existence of one must support element then saying you shall not error on any of the whole resource? So you can't error on the must support, but you also can't error on any other element as well.
Happy for your feedback on wordsmithing it. I'll get your point. Richard?
I like the thrust of what it's doing. I wonder, do we know how well or how nastily it plays out in derived profiles? Because yeah, hopefully that won't
I'll
be too
comment on
tricky.
that. So derived profile, just like we do, so let's think 5 vital signs, for example. In AU core, we pick up the body weight, right? That means we pick up the fact that something is flagged must support, but we don't actually pick up the meaning of the obligation. So anything picking up just the AU core, deriving from the AU core profiles, who isn't declaring themselves an AU core requester, doesn't pick up the obligation. They pick up the flag, and therefore the requirement for their use case to say what must support means for them, but they don't pick up the actual obligation we've defined that says belongs to an AU core requester. It's only if you say you're an AU core requester that you pick up this obligation.
So if I produce a profile which is derived from AU core and I say I'm derived from AU core, I can redefine the obligations. And if somebody wants to say that they conform to AU core, they'll have to do that explicitly. They can't just say they conform to mine and have the obligations pick up. They'd need to explicitly say they conform both to my profile and to AU core, because just because I'm derived from AU core doesn't say that the obligations are being conducted.
Correct. That's exactly why we've got profile only and then profile plus interaction with the capability statements on how you say you are conformant, that you are declaring that you're this kind of system actor. Yeah, that's right.
So you're not declaring to AU core, you're declaring as AU core requester. That's where the obligations apply at the actor level.
And these show up in the are obligations and must support part of the profile only conformance? Or
Because
are they part of the profile and interaction conformance?
I'll state this and Danielle can correct me if I'm wrong. Because we are stating it as AU core requester, that is the interaction capability, not the no profile obligation. Okay, it's must support.
Right.
All right, that's why this is clear around an AU core requester shall not error, and then conversely, AU core responder shall populate, but we're not actually saying anything about profile only in these particular obligation statements.
So must support winds up being sort of ignorable if you're only interested in the profile.
To a degree, yeah. Going back to that very first slide, he said must support is a flag, and then you are required to say what support means. So that's what we get both when we get things from the FHIR standard, and if you take that from AU core, yeah.
So we will need to define a profile only definition of must support?
Well, I mean, I
Or
guess at the
obligations for
moment,
must support?
There
would be
is
nice
one
to
already
define.
defined in the call, but it doesn't have a system actor, because what is your action? System actors at the moment are verbs, if you will. The profile only is just the data, regardless of how it was created, all those other things. It says the data is this shape. Data
Yeah.
validates.
So yeah, you could say must support's unimportant for them. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, take that a little bit too far, but yep. What did I just do there? Okay. So just to correlate that very quickly back to the current definition, you know, there is a dot point that we are removing out of that. The others are pretty well consistent, maybe with just some wording. All right, so that's just giving you a bit of a sense of what is the difference between what we currently have and what. So at this point in time, we're suggesting by using the obligation terminology. Similarly, with someone wanted to say something.
Sorry, it's me. The slide before this one,
Yeah.
I really struggled with the bottom right thing. The bottom right last dot point. Like I almost get the first sentence. This obligation also applies to elements that only contain an extension in place of a value where, and then I'm lost, or equivalent, should either of these be allowed on the consumer obligations. I don't get that last phrase at all.
So that's the missing data extensions. So
I understood it's the missing data extensions. I just don't understand after the last comma, should either of these be allowed on the consumer obligation? I
Agree, that's weird.
I almost feel like I don't need the last dot point. Like this obligation also applies to elements that only contain an extension in place of a value. I'm good there. I know what you're talking about. Maybe you could say point to the missing data thing.
This is not my definition, so you can ballot on HL7 FHIR if you like.
And I think we will. I think out of this, as we try to do it, we'll end up raising feedback against the HL7 FHIR codes.
All right, so I think we're at time.
We are.
And so there is a very similar slide here, which is basically just redefining the responder. And there's really not a lot of difference in this because we already use the language of populate in this particular scenario. That's why I've emphasized probably more so on the requester side today rather than the responder. But there was an item there that we thought was not useful. It was talking about in the context of a patient, not a general resource. And we've added in a little bit about being able to more tightly state obligations at an element level, if necessary. So that's pretty much where we're at. And then I was going to go off and look at some procedures, but we might do that another day.
Next Friday, Conformance Fridays. I agree, Sanjeet. I think that's what we've just said. Let's do procedures. Let's get more specific with examples.
That's
okay.
That was the next step. To
That's
revisit procedure.
Good session, everyone.
Thank you.
I think we've made progress. We had a lot of discussion, which is great for these Conformance Fridays. We've got another one next Friday. So I hope to see you there. Do a bit of reading again on obligation. Bring your questions. We're going to tackle procedure. That's the example we're going to go through. So have a look at AU core procedure. And we'll go through that next Friday. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Good weekend.
And thanks,
Thank
Heath.
you.
Great
Bye.
job.